On August 2, 1990, the world was shocked as Iraqi forces, led by President Saddam Hussein, invaded the small, oil-rich nation of Kuwait. This marked the beginning of the First Gulf War, a conflict that would shape the geopolitics of the Middle East for decades to come. But what led to this invasion, and how did the U.S.-led coalition successfully expel Iraq from Kuwait just a few months later in February 1991? In today's video, we're diving deep into the events of the First Gulf War, the key players, and the strategic moves that led to the expulsion of Iraqi forces. To understand the First Gulf War, we first need to explore the tense political landscape of the Middle East in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, was a key regional power. But Saddam's ambitions were not limited to Iraq. The 1980s saw Iraq engaged in an 8-year-long war with Iran known as the Iran-Iraq War, which drained Iraq's resources and left the nation deeply in debt. Iraq owed an estimated $80 billion, much of it to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Saddam Hussein was frustrated by Iraq's financial troubles and turned his gaze towards Kuwait. He accused Kuwait of exceeding OPEC oil production quotas, which he claimed was driving down oil prices and harming Iraq's economy. Hussein also accused Kuwait of slant drilling into Iraq's oil fields. On August 2, 1990, Saddam Hussein took a drastic step. Early in the morning, Iraqi troops launched a swift invasion of Kuwait. Within hours, Kuwait's small military was overwhelmed, and Baghdad declared Kuwait the 19th province of Iraq. The international community reacted with outrage. The United Nations swiftly condemned the invasion and imposed economic sanctions on Iraq. The world feared that Saddam Hussein's ambitions wouldn't stop at Kuwait and that he might target Saudi Arabia next, threatening global oil supplies. The United States, under President George H.W. Bush, was one of the first nations to respond. President Bush declared that the invasion was an act of aggression and called for the immediate withdrawal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait. But the U.S. didn't act alone. To counter Iraq, President Bush quickly began building an international coalition of countries. This coalition would eventually include not only the United States, but also nations from Europe, the Middle East, and even Asia. In total, 34 countries would contribute troops or support for the operation. One of the key players in this coalition was Saudi Arabia, which feared that Iraq might turn its sights on them next. The Saudi government offered to host American and allied troops on its soil, giving the U.S. military a strategic launch point for any future military operations. In response to Iraq's aggression, the United States initiated Operation Desert Shield on August 7, 1990. This operation was primarily a defensive measure to protect Saudi Arabia and prevent further Iraqi advances. Over the next few months, more than 500,000 U.S. troops were sent to the region, supported by tens of thousands of troops from other coalition nations. While the coalition forces built up their strength, they also began to launch a series of airstrikes to weaken Iraq's military infrastructure. These early airstrikes were part of the broader strategy to weaken Iraq before launching a ground invasion. After months of preparation, President Bush gave the go-ahead for the ground offensive. On January 16, 1991, the United States and its allies launched Operation Desert Storm, an offensive designed to drive Iraq out of Kuwait. The operation began with an intense air campaign aimed at destroying Iraq's military infrastructure and command centers. The airstrikes were followed by a massive ground assault led by U.S. General H. Norman Schwarzkopf. The U.S. military employed advanced technology, including precision-guided bombs, and the coalition forces made swift progress against the entrenched Iraqi military. After just 100 hours of intense fighting, Iraqi forces began to collapse. The coalition had successfully liberated Kuwait, and Iraqi forces retreated. Despite the overwhelming victory, Saddam Hussein was allowed to remain in power in Iraq. The decision not to pursue regime change was a point of contention, but at the time it was seen as necessary to avoid destabilizing the region further. By February 28, 1991, President Bush declared a ceasefire. The war was officially over, but its consequences would echo throughout the Middle East for years to come. Although Iraq had been expelled from Kuwait, the war's aftermath was far from over. The destruction caused by the conflict left Kuwait in ruins, and Iraq faced severe economic sanctions. The war also set the stage for future conflicts, including the Iraq War in 2003. Saddam Hussein's regime remained in power, and despite the global condemnation, Iraq's internal problems such as uprisings by the Kurds and Shiites were not addressed by the coalition. The sanctions on Iraq continued for years, leading to significant suffering among the Iraqi people. The First Gulf War left a lasting legacy on international relations and military strategy. It demonstrated the power of a well-coordinated international coalition and advanced military technology. It also shaped U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East for decades to come, setting the stage for the Iraq War of 2003 and ongoing conflicts in the region. The war was a clear victory for the U.S.-led coalition, but it also highlighted the complexities of Middle Eastern geopolitics. The removal of Iraqi forces from Kuwait was an essential moment in world history, but it was also just one chapter in a broader, ongoing story. Thanks for watching this deep dive into the First Gulf War. Let me know your thoughts about the war, its outcomes, and its lasting effects on global politics in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more historical insights. Until next time.